a WikiVidi Documentaries production. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Enjoy. Gun laws in Australia. Gun laws in Australia are mainly the jurisdiction of the country's states and territories, with the importation of guns regulated by the federal government. A person who possesses or uses a firearm must have a firearm license. License holders must demonstrate a genuine reason for holding a firearm license and must not be a prohibited person. All firearms in Australia must be registered by serial number to the owner, who also holds a firearms license. Firearms were introduced into Australia, with European settlement on the 26th of January 1788. The colony of New South Wales was initially a penal settlement, with the military garrison being armed. Firearms were also used for hunting, protection of persons and crops, in crime and fighting crime, and in many military engagements. In the last 2 decades of the 20th century, following several high-profile killing sprees, the federal government coordinated more restrictive firearms legislation with all state governments. Gun laws were largely aligned in 1996 by the National Firearms Agreement. Numerous studies on the effects of Australia's gun laws have concluded that the laws have been effective in reducing mass shootings, gun suicides, and armed crime, while other studies have argued that the laws have had little effect. Polling shows strong support for gun legislation in Australia, with around 85–90% of people wanting the same or greater level of restrictions. National legislative structure. Following shooting incidents at Port Arthur in 1996 and Monash University in 2002, the Australian, state and territory governments, through the then Australian Police Ministers' Council and Council of Australian Governments, entered into 3 national agreements that became responsible for the shaping of contemporary Australian firearm laws. These agreements were the ownership, possession and use of firearms in Australia is regulated by state laws. The Australian state and territory laws regulating firearms are, at the federal level, the importation of firearms is subject to the restrictions in Regulation 4F and Schedule 6 of the Customs Regulations 1956. Firearms categories. The National Firearm Agreement defines categories of firearms, with different levels of control for each, as follows. Certain antique firearms can in some states be legally held without a license. In other states they are subject to the same requirements as modern firearms. All single-shot muzzle-loading firearms manufactured before the 1st of January 1901 are considered antique firearms. 4 states require licenses for antique percussion revolvers and cartridge-repeating firearms, but in Queensland and Victoria a person may possess such a firearm without a license, so long as the firearm is registered. European settlement to 19th century. Firearms were introduced to Australia with European settlement on the 26th of January 1788. Though other seafarers that visited Australia before settlement also carried firearms, the colony of New South Wales was initially a penal settlement, with the military garrison being armed. Firearms were also used for hunting, protection of persons and crops, in crime and fighting crime, and in many military engagements. From the landing of the First Fleet there was conflict with Aborigines over game, access to fenced land, and spearing of livestock. Firearms were used to protect explorers and settlers from Aboriginal attack. A number of punitive raids and massacres of Aboriginals were carried out in a series of local conflicts. From the beginning there were controls on firearms. The firearms issued to convicts and settlers were stolen and misused, and this resulted in more controls. In January 1796, David Collins wrote that several attempts had been made to ascertain the number of arms in the possession of individuals, as many were feared to be in the hands of those who committed depredations. The Crown recalled between 200 and 300 stands of arms, but not 50 stands were accounted for. Australian colonists also used firearms in conflict with bushrangers and armed rebellions such as the 1804 Castle Hill Convict Rebellion and the 1854 Eureka Stockade. 20th century. Gun laws were the responsibility of each colony and, since federation in 1901, of each state. The Commonwealth does not have constitutional authority over firearms, but it has jurisdiction over customs and defense matters. Federally, the external affairs powers can be used to enforce internal control over matters agreed in external treaties. In New South Wales, handguns were effectively banned after World War II, but the 1956 Melbourne Olympic Games sparked a new interest in the sport of pistol shooting, and laws were changed to allow the sport to develop. 1984-2014 Multiple killings. From 1984 to 1996, multiple killings aroused public concern. The 1984 Milkborough massacre was a major incident in a series of conflicts between various outlaw motorcycle gangs. In 1987, the Hoddle Street Massacre and the Queen Street Massacre took place in Melbourne. In response, several states required the registration of all guns, and restricted the availability of self-loading rifles and shotguns. In the Strathfield Massacre in New South Wales, 1991, 2 were killed with a knife, and 5 more with a firearm. Tasmania passed a law in 1991 for firearm purchasers to obtain a licence, though enforcement was light. Firearm laws in Tasmania and Queensland remained relatively relaxed. For long arms shooting, massacres in Australia and other English-speaking countries often occurred close together in time. Forensic psychiatrists attribute this to copycat behavior, which is in many cases triggered by sensational media treatment. Mass murderers study media reports and imitate the actions and equipment that are sensationalized in them. Port Arthur Massacre. The Port Arthur Massacre in 1996 transformed gun control legislation in Australia. 35 people were killed and 23 wounded when the gunman opened fire on shop owners and tourists with 2 semi-automatic rifles. This mass killing horrified the Australian public. The massacre occurred 6 weeks after the Dunblane massacre in Scotland. Prime Minister John Howard took the gun law proposals developed from the report of the 1988 National Committee on Violence and convinced the states to adopt them under a national firearms agreement. This was necessary, because the Australian Constitution does not give the Commonwealth power to enact gun laws. In the face of some state resistance, Howard threatened to hold a nationwide referendum to alter the Australian Constitution, and give the federal government constitutional power over guns. The proposals included a ban on all semi-automatic rifles and all semi-automatic and pump-action shotguns, and a system of licensing and ownership controls. The Howard government held a series of public meetings to explain the proposed changes. In the first meeting, Howard wore a bullet-resistant vest, which was visible under his jacket. Many shooters were critical of this. Some firearm owners applied to join the Liberal Party in an attempt to influence the government, but the party barred them from membership. A court action by 500 shooters seeking admission to membership eventually failed in the Supreme Court of South Australia. The Australian Constitution requires just compensation be given for property taken over, so the federal government introduced the Medicare Levy Amendment Act 1996 to raise the predicted cost of $500 million Australian dollars through a one-off increase in the Medicare levy. The gun buyback scheme started on the 1st of October 1996 and concluded on the 30th of September 1997. The government bought back and destroyed over 1 million firearms. Monash University shootings. In October 2002, a commerce student killed 2 fellow students at Monash University in Victoria with pistols he had acquired as a member of a shooting club. The gunman, Huan Yun Siang, was acquitted of crimes related to the shootings due to mental impairment, but ordered to be detained in Thomas Embling Hospital, a high-security hospital, for up to 25 years. As in 1996, the federal government urged state governments to review handgun laws, and amended legislation was adopted in all states and territories. Changes included a 10-round magazine capacity limit, a caliber limit of not more than .38 inches, a barrel length limit of not less than 120 mm for semi-automatic pistols and 100 mm for revolvers, and even stricter probation and attendance requirements for sporting target shooters. Whilst handguns for sporting shooters are nominally restricted to .38 inches as a maximum caliber, it is possible to obtain an endorsement allowing calibers up to .45 inches to be used for metallic silhouette or single-action shooting matches. These new laws were opposed not only by sporting shooters groups, but also by gun control supporters, who saw it as paying for shooters to upgrade to new guns. One government policy was to compensate shooters for giving up the sport. Approximately 25% of pistol shooters took this offer, and relinquished their licenses and their right to own pistols for sport for 5 years. In Victoria, it is estimated 1/3 of people surrendering firearms took this option. 2014 Sydney hostage crisis. On 16 December 2014, a lone gunman, Manharan Monash, held hostage 17 customers and employees of a Lindt chocolate cafe located at Martin Place in Sydney, Australia. The perpetrator was on bail at the time and had previously been convicted of a range of offences. 2 of the hostages and the perpetrator died. In August 2015, Mike Baird and Troy Grant announced a tightening of laws on bail and illegal firearms, creating a new offence for the possession of a stolen firearm, with a maximum of 14 years imprisonment, and establishing an illegal firearms investigation and reward scheme. This legislative change also introduced measures to reduce illegal firearms in NSW, including a ban on the possession of digital blueprints that enable firearms to be manufactured using 3D printers and milling machines for anyone without an appropriate license. Gun amnesties. In New South Wales, there have been 3 gun amnesties in 2001, 2003 and 2009. 63,000 handguns were handed in during the first 2 amnesties and over 4,323 handguns were handed in during the 3rd amnesty. During the 3rd amnesty, 21,615 firearm registrations were received by the Firearms Registry. The surrendered firearms were all destroyed. 2017 National Firearms Amnesty. On the 16th of June 2017, the Minister for Justice Michael Keenan announced that a national firearms amnesty would commence on the 1st of July 2017, for 3 months until September 30th, to hand in unregistered or unwanted firearms. The amnesty had been approved in March 2017 by the Firearms and Weapons Policy Working Group to reduce the number of unregistered firearms in Australia following the Lindt Cafe siege in 2014. And the 2015 shooting of an unarmed police civilian finance worker outside the New South Wales Police Force headquarters in Parramatta, Sydney. The firearms amnesty was the first national amnesty since the 1996 Port Arthur massacre. Measures and trends in social problems related to firearms. Between 1991 and 2001, the number of firearm-related deaths in Australia declined by 47%. Suicides committed with firearms accounted for 77% of these deaths, followed by firearms homicide, firearms accidents, firearms deaths resulting from legal intervention, and undetermined deaths. The number of firearms suicides was in decline consistently from 1991 to 1998, 2 years after the introduction of firearm regulation. Suicide deaths using firearms more than halved in 10 years, from 389 deaths in 1995 to 147 deaths in 2005. This is equal to 7% of all suicides in 2005. Over the same period, suicides by hanging increased by over 52% from 699 in 1995 to 1,068 in 2005. The number of guns stolen fell from an average 4,195 per year from 1994 to 2000 to 1,526 in 2006-2007. Long guns are more often stolen opportunistically in home burglaries, but few homes have handguns, and a substantial proportion of stolen handguns are taken from security firms and other businesses. Only a tiny proportion, 0.06% of licensed firearms, are stolen in a given year. Only a small proportion of those firearms are recovered. About 3% of these stolen weapons are later connected to an actual crime or found in the possession of a person charged with a serious offense. Research. In 1997, the Prime Minister appointed the Australian Institute of Criminology to monitor the effects of the gun buyback. The institute has published a number of papers reporting trends and statistics around gun ownership and gun crime. Many studies have followed, providing varying results stemming from different methodologies and areas of focus. David Hemingway and Mary Vryniotis of Harvard University, funded by the Joyce Foundation, summarized the research in 2011 and concluded, "It would have been difficult to imagine more compelling future evidence of a beneficial effect." They said that a complication in evaluating the effect of the NFA was that gun deaths were falling in the early 1990s. They added that everyone should be pleased with the immediate and continuing reduction in firearm suicide and firearm homicide following the NFA. Suicide reduction from firearm regulation is disputed by Richard Harding in his 1981 book, Firearms and Violence in Australian Life, where, after reviewing Australian statistics, he said that, whatever arguments might be made for the limitation or regulation of the private ownership of firearms, suicide patterns do not constitute one of them. Harding quoted a 1969 international analysis by Newton and Simmering of 20 developed countries, which concluded at page 36 of their report, cultural factors appear to affect suicide rates far more than the availability and use of firearms. Thus, suicide rates would not seem to be readily affected by making firearms less available. Harding later supported 1985 laws to restrict gun ownership in New South Wales, saying that laws contributing to slowing down in the growth of the Australian gun inventory are to be welcomed. In 2002, Jenny Muzos, from the Australian Institute of Criminology, examined the rate of firearm theft in Australian states and territories following the firearm regulation. She found that the NFA is having the desired effect. Securely stored firearms are proving less vulnerable to theft. In 2003, researchers from the Monash University Accident Research Centre examined firearm deaths and mortality in the years before and after firearm regulation. They concluded that there was dramatic reduction in firearm deaths and especially suicides due to the implementation of strong regulatory reform. Multiple studies have been conducted by Dr. Janine Baker and Dr. Samara McPhedran, researchers with the International Coalition for Women in Shooting and Hunting. In 2006 they reported a lack of a measurable effect from the 1996 firearms legislation in the British Journal of Criminology. Using a REMA analysis, they found little evidence for an impact of the laws on homicide, but did for suicide. Subsequently, they compared the incidence of mass shootings in Australia and New Zealand. Data was standardized to a rate per 100,000 people, to control for differences in population size between the countries, and mass shootings before and after 1996-1997 were compared between countries. That study found that in the period 1980-1996, both countries experienced mass shootings. The rate did not differ significantly between countries. Since 1996-1997, neither country has experienced a mass shooting event despite the continued availability of semi-automatic long arms in New Zealand. The authors conclude that, if civilian access to certain types of firearms explain the occurrence of mass shootings in Australia, then New Zealand would have continued to experience mass shooting events. In 2012, McPhedran and Baker found there was little evidence for any impacts of the gun laws on firearm suicide among people under 35 years of age, and suggest that the significant financial expenditure associated with Australia's firearms method restriction measures may not have had any impact on youth suicide. Head of the New South Wales Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research, Don Weatherburn, described the Baker and McPhedran article as reputable and well conducted, but also stated that it would be wrong to infer from the study that it does not matter how many guns there are in the community. Simon Chapman stated this study ignored the mass shootings issue such as Port Arthur massacre. Weatherburn noted the importance of actively policing illegal firearm trafficking, and argued that there was little evidence that the new laws had helped in this regard. He also stated that the 1996 legislation had little to no effect on violence, saying the laws did not result in any acceleration of the downward trend in gun homicide. A 2006 study co-authored by Simon Chapman concluded, Australia's 1996 gun law reforms were followed by more than a decade free of fatal mass shootings, and accelerated declines in firearm deaths, particularly suicides. Total homicide rates followed the same pattern. Removing large numbers of rapid-firing firearms from civilians may be an effective way of reducing mass shootings, firearm homicides, and firearm suicides. In 2007, a meta-analysis published in the Australian Medical Association's The Medical Journal of Australia researched nationwide firearm suicides. They said that the analysis was consistent with the hypothesis that measures to control the availability of firearms have resulted in a decline in total suicide rates, and recommended further reduction in the availability of lethal means. A 2008 study on the effects of the firearm buybacks by Wang Shengli and Sandy Swadi of University of Melbourne and La Trobe University studied the data and concluded, the NFA did not have any large effects on reducing firearm homicide or suicide rates. In 2009, a study published in the Journal of Sociology examined the rate of firearm suicide in Queensland. They found that gun suicides are continuing to decrease in Queensland, and is most likely as a function of ongoing gun controls. In 2009, another paper from the Australian Institute for Suicide Research and Prevention at Griffith University also studied suicide in Queensland only. They said no significant difference was found in the rate pre/post the introduction of the NFA in Queensland. However, a significant difference was found for Australian data, the quality of which is noticeably less satisfactory. A 2010 study by Christine Neal and Andrew Lee found the 1997 gun buyback scheme reduced firearm suicides by 74% while having no effect on non-firearm suicides or substitution of method. A 2014 report stated that approximately 260,000 guns are on the Australian grey or black markets, and discussed the potential problem of people using 3D printers to create guns. NSW and Victorian Police obtained plans to create 3D printed guns and tested to see if they could fire, but the guns exploded during testing. In a 2013 report, Samantha Bricknell from the Australian Institute of Criminology, Frederic Lemieux and Tim Prenzler compared mass shootings between America and Australia and found the 1996 NFA coincided within the cessation of mass shooting events in Australia, and that there were reductions in America that were evident during the 1994-2004 U.S. federal assault weapon ban. A 2015 journal article in the International Review of Law and Economics evaluated the effect of the NFA on overall crime, rather than just firearm deaths like other studies, using the difference in differences identification approach. They found that after the NFA, there were significant decreases in armed robbery and attempted murder relative to sexual assault. In 2016, 4 researchers evaluated the National Firearms Agreement after 20 years in relation to mental health. They said that the NFA exemplifies how firearms regulation can prevent firearm mortality and injuries. In 2016, a study by Adam Langford, Associate Professor of Criminal Justice, examined the links between public mass shootings and gun availability in various countries. He found that the restrictions in Australia were effective, concluding that, in the wake of these policies, Australia has yet to experience another public mass shooting. A 2017 oral presentation published in Injury Prevention examined the effect of the NFA on overall firearm mortality. They found that the NFA decreased firearm deaths by 61% and concluded that Australian firearm regulations indeed contributed to a decline in firearm mortality. After this study, these researchers were reported in the Journal of Experimental Criminology in connection with another study with Charles Branas at Columbia University, which concluded current evidence showing decreases in firearm mortality after the 1996 Australian National Firearm Law relies on an empirical model that may have limited ability to identify the true effects of the law. Brought to you by WikiVidi Documentaries. Would you like to know more?